It gave me plenty to think about when I walk at night. Maybe it'll give you something to think about too. When he looks at you and me, when he looks at us, would he say the same? Your deeds of late are greater than they were at first. I know that feeling. Okay, let's go on. That's what he sees on the positive side. But that's not why his eyes are aflame. And that's not why he is outfitted for battle. It's because of what he sees on the negative side. This takes a little bit of unpacking, so stay with me. Let me stop here and see, have I lost you on any of this that I'm talking about? I'm happy to loop back. Tyler, you okay? Okay. No, thanks. Oh, what? Oh, I'm fine, yeah. Here's what he sees on the end. Busted. Here's what you see on the other side. He said, I have this against you. That you tolerate a woman named Jezebel and her teaching. That's not a good translation. It is her deception, her seduction. And it's a seduction twofold, as it always is, into immorality, sexual immorality, and idolatry. Now, there's a lot of things to unpack here, so bear with me. About the worst king that Israel had in the Old Testament was a guy named Ahab. And he was bad. And one of the first things he did as he came to be king, if you check in 1 Kings 16, is he married Jezebel. It's amazing how life can go from bad to worse when you don't marry well. And he didn't marry well. And we're told in the Old Testament in 1 Kings 16, she led them into the worship of Baal. Some people say Baal. I was telling Mel, Hebrew, it's weird pronunciation to us. Okay, everything is real guttural, so it's not Baal. We pulled it forward. It's actually Baal. Now, you all have heard the stories in the Old Testament about the children of Israel and battling the prophets of Baal and all that sort of stuff. You all familiar with that? Let's go ahead, though, and break this down, and I'm not going to have enough time. I'm sorry, but this is really important. Baal was a fertility god. You know what that is? Fertility god, meaning we like more stuff. Meaning we want good crops, but not just good crops. We want a lot of sheep, cattle, whatever, born to us. We want those things to be fertile, but not just that. We want us to be fertile. Baal worship was all about fertility. And when that's the case, two things always emerge that are life-destroying. They are destroying of human life in terms of our dignity. They are destroying of human life in terms of our own sense of integrity. You see why? All that matters is productivity. And whenever you talk fertility and you talk about fertility gods, I don't know about you, but when it comes to human fertility, fertility's fun. Baal worship always takes you to productivity and to pleasure. And from pleasure, it usually goes into perversion. Because we're just about indulging our pleasures. Do you see how damaging this can be? Not just to a spirit, but to a human society. Think about it. What drives it all is productivity, meaning usefulness to me. What drives it all is pleasure, meaning what pleasures me. And everything falls to the side to those two things. So we think, okay, well, this was 2,500 years ago, Baal worship. Oh, and it was. But in Jesus' day, they didn't call it Baal. But in Thyatira, they had all these local deities, and guess what they were? Fertility gods. And coupled with that, they had what were called trade guilds, basically unions. And these unions would revolve around the local deity, the fertility god. And the Christians who had their livelihood at these places would not participate because they knew what went on. They knew that people would be thrown aside. They know that people would be used for sexual pleasures and then thrown aside. They knew that it was basically this orgiastic kind of gathering when they'd have these feasts and festivals, and they wouldn't participate. So you know what the Christians were called then, don't you? Narrow-minded and prudes, and they were hateful, and they were bigoted. You have to understand something else. We do understand that Baal is alive and well, so to speak, today, don't we? Our country, so many good things, the evil one comes and then distorts so that it distorts the good into something that isn't good at all. Who doesn't want to be productive in their work, right? But what happens when productivity drives it? Do you see what happens? Here's my story. It's hard. Here's my story. My dad was an incredibly gifted man. He was a driven guy, real charismatic kind of guy. My brother got all those good things. But there came a time where my mom and the four of us kids weren't useful to him. And a better opportunity came for him to pursue his career. And so, because we weren't useful, guess who got jettisoned? And so now 4 kids grow up without a father. And my mom became a single mother in a small town trying to support 4 kids. All in the name of productivity. We weren't useful to him. You know what that's called? I just bent the knee to Baal. I can go further if you like. Here's the young lady, or maybe the young woman, and she comes along and she finds herself with a pregnancy she hadn't planned on, but that's not going to be useful to her. So what do? This unborn child isn't useful. Therefore, it's killed. You know why? It isn't useful. And Baal is worshipped again. Do you see how awful this is? The early Christians were attacked. Days of Thyatira, they were attacked. You know why? Part of the reason is not just they wouldn't participate in the feast, but they wouldn't expose their children. And exposing children meant if you had a child born to you and it wasn't the gender you want, you just set it out with the trash to let the dogs eat it. And Christians wouldn't do it because they wouldn't bend the knee to Baal. And then it's all about what I think is useful for me. They were called haters of God and uncivil because they would do that. What about the folks where their elderly parents can't contribute anymore? In a society that's obsessed with productivity, and here's someone who can't contribute anymore. And you know what we do. You know what goes on across this country. We either send them or we end them. You know why? Because we haven't seen it and it hasn't been unmasked, but we're bending the knee to Baal. And it's repugnant to God. He hates it. And he hates it because of what it does to human beings. We've reduced human beings to simply what they can do for us. That's one part of it. Here's the other part. The other part of the whole Baal worship and fertility is the whole sexual behaviors. And when those things aren't managed and directed in a way that God has kind of described and prescribed for us, it gets incredibly destructive. To the victims we leave behind with it, to our own soul. We've been sold this piece of goods that says that we can do things sexually and it doesn't really have any effect on us and our heart, and it just is a lie. It's right out of Jezebel's mouth. There is always this connection between body and spirit, and what we do with our body has repercussion for our spirit. And what's going on in our spirit needs to be expressed through our body. But Jezebel, quote unquote, comes along and says, those feasts, we all know that those gods really aren't anything there, so go ahead and participate. It'll make your life easier. These things and this idea about just being enlightened and not being old-fashioned and all that blah, blah, blah in regard to our own sexual behaviors. We all know better than that. Let's just get on the program with everybody else and mirror the culture. Do you see what happens? Not just to a church that buys into that. This is the only place in the Revelation, by the by. This is the only place where the discussion about deception is applied to the people of God. Every other place, it's always the people. The world is being deceived. Here it's talking about his people being deceived. So do you see why it's such a big deal? If we're deceived, who's going to be light and salt to the others who are deceived? This troubles me sometimes in the movement as far as for certain churches where we don't seem to understand we can't compromise about who God is. We can't compromise about who Jesus is. We can't compromise about what Jesus values. Because if we compromise it, what do we have to offer a world that's lost? What do we have to bring to them that they're lost as a goose and they can't find their way? And they're destroying themselves and each other. And now we're part of that too? This isn't about being hateful. It's about saying, our commitment to the good outweighs the temporary comfort of the relationship. And I've gone past my time, so can you bear with me? Another 4 minutes. That's what Jesus sees. Jezebel is the seducer, and they package things up, and it's particularly difficult at Thyatira. What you see at Pergamum is he says, you have this teaching here, you're not rejecting it. All the way back to Ephesus, he says, you have this teaching here, and you are rejecting it, good for you. So you see what's going on? Ephesus rejects it. Pergamum kind of doesn't reject it. Thyatira is buying in. It's crisis. So Jesus, this is what he says. First, patience. I've given her time to repent. I've given her time to change. Isn't that interesting? His first word isn't judgment. His first word is patience. But here's the sobering thought. His patience is met with continued refusal to turn, to change. And there is a point where the patience is exchanged for the burnished bronze. And I'm coming. We don't say that enough, but we probably need to say that. Our God is an incredibly patient God. Paul says that's why I receive patience, just so you'll know just how patient he is. But there is an end to the patience if there's ongoing refusal to turn. That's just what the Bible says. It's what Jesus says. So the first word is patience, and let's be glad of that. The second thing that he has to say is judgment, and it's coming. And it's for Jezebel, for those who participate with her, or as we say, who adulterer with her, and her children. Now, children doesn't mean her offspring. We get that, right? It doesn't mean I'm going to kill your babies. Children, in this sense, means follower. So when people are followers, sometimes it's talking about they are a child of blah, 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 blah. So when Jesus is talking about it, he's saying, you know what, you are buying in, and you don't understand. This is exactly where this is going to go. This is where it's going to take you, and there is nothing good where you're going to land. Anyone up on your Middle Ages and the Crusades? I'm going to get this introduction in after all. In 1212, there was the Children's Crusade. Anyone familiar with the Children's Crusade? Well, the Crusades were going on. Obviously, we're trying to liberate, right? The Christians were trying to release Jerusalem from the Muslim control, and particularly the Holy Sepulchre. And in different waves, some were successful, some were not, and they called them crusades. But someone had the brilliant idea, a little 12-year-old boy had a brilliant idea, which is, I'm going to lead children because we will win them with love. And we will win them over, we will win the Muslims over with our innocence. And so there are thousands of these kids, like 12 and under, heading off to try to go as far as to get to cross the Mediterranean Sea and get there to Jerusalem, and that by their love and their innocence of presence, they will cause the Muslims to defer and convert. So they go and they get there and they get to the edge of the Mediterranean. Somewhere someone came up with the idea that just like Moses probably, because their quest was so noble that the Mediterranean Sea would part, and it didn't. But there were two merchants who saw their predicament and offered them portage. Is that right? Portage? Transport. Maybe their names should have tipped them off. One was William of Poscaris, which doesn't really tip you off. The other guy's name was Hugh the Iron. So they provided them vessels. They loaded the kids aboard. They got out to the Mediterranean, but they didn't go to the place that would take them to Jerusalem. They went to North Africa, where they sold all the kids off as slaves. That's where that ship was going to go. That's where these guys were going to take them. And when they got on board, even though they didn't think that's where they really wanted to go, that's where they wound up, precisely because they got on board with these guys. The word of Jesus about this is judgment to Jezebel, those who participate with her in the adultery, so to speak, and those who follow along and get on board. The judgment comes in the form of three things: sickness, affliction, and death. This is serious stuff. It's right in there. Sickness, affliction, and death. And that's what Jesus has to say about it. It just isn't the last thing that he says. The last thing he says is, to those who don't get on board, hold fast. I'm not putting anything on you other than what you're doing. Be faithful, right? And then he has this promise. And here's the promise. To the one who overcomes, I'm going to give you authority and victory and glory. And let me rephrase that. I'm going to give you my authority, my victory, my glory. He draws from Psalm 2 there about the whole busting up the clay with the rod of iron. You know what that's saying? Those who oppose my people won't be broken, but they will be. You have that authority. Victory, that's what morning star is, apparently. Morning star is a reference to Venus. That in the skies, when Venus appears, it is the star of glory. It's the morning star. And so it's this idea of glory. But it's also, here's the other thing, and then I'll be done. It is Venus that was put on the banners of the Roman armies. And it was their symbol of, we cannot be defeated. And Jesus says, you know what's on the banners there of the Roman army? It's not really true for them. It's just on their banners. I'm giving you the morning star. I will not be defeated. And if you are mine, you will not be defeated. We will not be defeated. I give you the morning star.